well, without the New Deal, millions of Americans would have starved. Literally, tens of thousands would have probably starved to death. I'm very happy that we're going to go to his memorial later on. But my point is, Depression, Second World War, 1941, you have to try and defeat barbaric militarism, truly barbaric militarism in the Pacific and in Europe. And that's a country that is very badly prepared. 1939, federally limited army of less than 200,000. And you did it in 4 years. And with an enormous impact on this country, socially, economically, politically, racially. And then that generation, that so-called greatest generation, came back to America, and they didn't put the war behind them. I don't believe any World War II veteran put the war behind them. They put it to the side, and they built what we see now as modern America. So it's an extraordinary achievement. And to me, the most heroic of that generation were not just those who fought on battlefields, but were those who came back and were able to endure and overcome, in many cases, severe PTSD, and to carry on. They were able to actually function, which, given the level of damage that was done to them, the sheer numbers of Americans that went through extremely damaging experiences psychologically, was also made them quite remarkable. So I wanted to talk a little bit about various minority groups from this country. This is a country of immigration. People tend to forget that America is a country which quintessentially is an immigrant nation. I'm an immigrant. I didn't come across the border from Mexico. I came from, middle class, probably a little bit too well-educated England, but I've felt the immigrant experience. I do speak English, but it's a different language. The one I grew up learning is a different one. So I speak English, you speak American, put it that way. Anyway. I was asked a couple of years ago, I'll speed up now. I was asked a couple of years ago by AARP magazine, which has the largest readership of any magazine in the world, because when people get to, what is it, 55? Is it 50? Oh my God, I've qualified for 7 years. Anyway, you get AARP magazine, and I was asked to write an article for the 80th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. And the editor said to me, can you create a list of Americans and go through this list and ask them how Pearl Harbor changed their lives? This is December the 7th, 1941. What happened when you heard about Pearl Harbor? What then happened in your life? Well, as we know, for all Americans, things changed massively when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And the editor said to me, can we have a Native American? Can we have a woman? Can we have an African American? Can we have a Japanese American? Can we have a list of this long list? And I'm like, well, I'm not sure whether I can find an African American who's 100 years old that remembers Pearl Harbor. I'm not sure that I can find a Native American, but anyway, I did manage to find quite a few of them. I would remind you that to legally have served in World War II, you'd have to be 98 now. So we are talking about the very end of this generation. So I'll just go through some of the characters that I chose. And as with all these subjects, when you talk about ethnicity, minorities, and race, you have to be somewhat careful, because you want to include everyone. You want to give different groups different weights. But I'm going to try and give you a smorgasbord, if you like, a picture of the extraordinary complexity of that force that defeated fascism and brutal militarism in the Pacific. It's quite extraordinary. So I thought I'd go through the war by date. So this is December 7th, 1941. And Thomas Begay is one of only 3, I believe, Navajo code talkers alive today. There were some 400 in World War II. He lives on Window Rock Reservation in Arizona, I believe. You can correct me, anybody here that it's from Arizona. I've actually been to that reservation, and when I say reservation, it really is a reservation. Native Americans in America in the 1930s earned on average a quarter of working class white Americans. That's a quarter. And I am sad to say that one of the few groups that have not benefited significantly since the 1930s in this country are Native Americans. They still earn around about a quarter, or even less in some places, than white working class Americans. So Thomas Piguet joined the Marines, very proud member of the Marines. All of his family, by the way, all of his sons have served in the US military. It's an odd paradox that you know that you get treated really badly, you serve your country, and then your entire family ends up serving the US military. And we'll talk a little bit about that sense of belonging and patriotism and what that means later on. So he's obviously still alive today because I interviewed him recently. And he was at Iwo Jima. He saw the flag raising at Iwo Jima, that iconic moment in February 1945. And at the end of the war, he realized that he and his fellow code talkers, during the Battle of Iwo Jima, 12,000 Americans killed, that they'd sent over 800 different messages, and not one of them was incorrect. So a phenomenal contribution to the war effort. And sadly, one of only 3 alive today. So when we talk about minorities, I think this woman is very interesting. She's actually buried at Arlington, where we'll be later in this week. And she's the first Hispanic woman, but also the first Puerto Rican woman to serve in the US Women's Army Corps. And she actually arrived in North Africa in January the 27th, 1943, and was one of 200 women in the US Women's Army Corps who served in North Africa. What was interesting is that they didn't have full status. They were treated as auxiliaries. So if they were captured by the enemy, for example, they would not be subject to the Geneva Conventions. They were not paid the same pay scale as other women or other people in the US Army. They were basically second class. So I think it's interesting that she raises the issue for me, which is that many women's lives were massively changed by World War II. They saw service. I'm going to show you a few more images. And of course, they left the home. They were no longer playing that traditional role, if you like, of the housewife. They went and worked, some of them 12-hour shifts in factories, in the making B-17s, making Shermans, doing men's jobs, because the men had obviously gone into uniform and were serving overseas. And what's interesting is that this 4 years of immense liberation from the kitchen, from the home, from these traditional roles, was something that many women, for example, Carmen, and many women that went and worked in factories, when the war ended, they were like, okay, well, I don't want to go back and be a housewife all the time. I love being a mother, I love being raising my family, but I'd like to have a job, or I'd like to serve on equal terms with other men in the army. One thing to note is that the GI Bill, which was introduced in 1943, the greatest piece of social engineering in the US history, changed America more than any other legislative act, I believe, in American history, because it allowed you to have a middle class post-war. Working class GIs went to college for free. Imagine how radical that is today. Can you imagine being able to tell all of your students, by the way, you can go to college for free? How would that transform America? In the late 40s and 50s, it completely transformed America. Why do you think you have doctors, dentists, engineers, surgeons, lawyers that came from humble backgrounds? They didn't pay to go to college. That was the GI Bill. Also guaranteed medical benefits. It was born out of a massive, deep-seated paranoia in America that if all these millions of GIs came back and had to go on to dole queues or be unemployed, that there would be social division and that would be terrible riots and America would fall into anarchy. So the GI Bill, this immensely generous, important act of legislation, was born out of fear of the elites, thinking that these guys that had gone and fought and defeated fascism would come home and then would try and defeat authoritarian forces that denied them employment. But women were excluded from the GI Bill. So she served all the way through World War II, and I'm going to talk about other women that did too, and came back and didn't have that opportunity. They weren't given that opportunity. So I think what this raises is the issue that there's this beautiful window of opportunity. For the first time, you can be a black fighter pilot. There'd never been a black civilian pilot in America. Can you believe that? Before World War II, there was not a single black civilian pilot for an airline. World War II, suddenly they're fighter pilots and aces. And then they come back to America, and senators in Mississippi are saying we must not have mongrelization. And the thing that we need to do most, and I can quote the guy's name later on, the thing that we need to do most is to make sure that we have segregation. We need to protect segregation as much as the atomic bomb secrets. And yet you had been fighting abroad to defeat the most evil racist regime, I believe, that's ever existed. So there are many ironies that pile upon ironies. This is Julia Parsons. I spoke to her a couple of years ago, and I was very intimidated by her because she's a lot sharper than I am, and she's like 100 years old. Really, really smart. And I asked her a woolly question, and she's like, what kind of question is that, you know? But she was a code breaker. She's a classic example. She went to college, Carnegie Mellon, and in 1943, she graduated. And for the first time, she went into the waves. The waves were begun in 1943, and because she was really smart and she'd been to college and she specialized in mathematics, she became a code breaker. And in fact, some of the work that she did was very important in terms of the Battle of the Atlantic. She broke certain U-boat codes, and she said, it troubled me because I thought that by my daily job, breaking these codes was going to get a lot of young Germans killed, and in fact, it did. So she ended the war with a great track record of service, and then couldn't talk about her job because it was top secret. So she said, I didn't get to talk to my family about what I did in the war. I said, well, I served my country. I've got the uniform. I had the uniform. It looked great. It was beautiful uniforms. And she didn't even get to talk to her family about what she did as a proud American woman until the 1990s, because it was all classified. And that's the case of a lot of people that worked in intelligence. Their families never got to know what they really did. And in fact, many of her peers passed away before they were allowed to actually talk about what they did in the war. So this is a really beautiful photograph. I wrote a book called The Bedford Boys, which is about, as you guys know, is about Bedford, Virginia, and how 19 guys from a community of around about 3,000 died on Omaha Beach in the first wave. And the pictures you see of Company A, a National Guard unit from the 1930s, look exactly like this, except for one big difference. This is the first and only entirely Chicano, basically Chicano National Guard unit or Army unit, full stop, in entire World War II. Every single guy in this picture is from the barrio. They're all from El Paso and that area of Texas. And it's the only unit that was all Chicano in World War II. And it was one of the most fearsome and most damaged units. And by damaged, I mean they've served in the Italian campaign in the 36th Infantry Division. That's a National Guard unit. It's a Texas National Guard unit that was chewed up over and over and over again, to the point where by the fall of 1944, the leadership lacked a kind of passion and authority within the US Army itself. The 36th Infantry Division was seen as the broken division. So they served in Sicily, and then particularly from Salerno. Last night I was boring you guys way too much. It was too hot, but I talked about Salerno and the Italian campaign. And this unit landed in Salerno in September of 1943, actually 9th of September 1943, and suffered huge casualties over the next few months. In fact, in the Rapido River crossing in January 1944, and the Rapido is north of Salerno in Italy, over 75% of that unit there became casualties or were killed, which is an extraordinarily high number. If you looked at that picture and it said the Bedford Boys, on D-Day, it would be over 92%. But 75% casualties is a very high number. The ethnic group, and I'm going to call them an ethnic group, the ethnic group with the largest number, with the highest number per capita, if you like, of medals of honor are Chicanos, are Hispanic Americans. So that tells you a lot about their fierce pride and sense of community. I will add a little story to this. I don't want to go on too long. I'll add a little story to this. When I was writing The Liberator, the book about Felix Sparks served in the 45th Infantry Division that fought side by side with the 3rd Infantry Division and the 36th. And that became the 5th Army in Italy. They fought in Sicily, they fought in Italy, and then they became the 7th Army and fought all the way to Dachau in southern Germany, end of the war. Such 3 divisions making up the rump of this army. And he said to me that he came from Arizona, a small mining community in Arizona, massive unemployment in the 1930s. And he said that when I went to high school, there was massive discrimination against Mexicans. They were called the Mexicans. Huge discrimination. He said, when I went to Fort Sill in Oklahoma in early 1941, when I was called up, they had signs on bars that said, no Indians, no Mexicans. So we don't understand this, the level of, I don't think it's hard for us to understand the level of prejudice that existed against Mexican Americans in large parts of this country in the 1930s and through the war. But Sparks told me, he said that, you know, I was there in Italy. He was there in Italy when these guys are fighting. And I thought to myself, these guys have not been in combat under my command before. He was a company commander, E Company, 157th Infantry Regiment. And he said, why the hell are they going to bother giving their lives to this country? Why would you bother? You've been treated like that as a second-class citizen, denied employment, denied opportunities. It was the white boys in the mining town in Arizona that got one of the only jobs going, never a Mexican. Beaten up in the classroom at high school all the time. Why would you bother fighting for Uncle Sam? And he said, I was surprised that they did, and they fought harder than others. And I think I want you to think about that question. Why, if you are an African American, if you're Native American, if you're from this kind of background, why are you going to fight just as hard, if not harder? What is that about? So here we have Van T. Barfoot. So 44,000 Native Americans saw service in World War II. And I actually had the great privilege. He belongs to the 157th Infantry Regiment. That's the same infantry regiment as Felix Sparks, the Liberator. And I got to actually meet him. I stood on a stage next to him. My God, I'm going back way back now, in 2007 or 8. And it was at a reunion for his regiment. It was in Denver. And he scared the hell out of me. And there's this cliche that Native Americans are all braves, you know, that they'll slit your throat, they fight like cowboys and westerns, you know, like they're incredibly brave. He was just fierce. And he was fiercely patriotic. And he belonged to the Choctaw Nation. His grandmother was part of that nation, but he refused to take up that identity for the rest of his life. He didn't want to be identified as a Native American because as he told people, I didn't want anybody to give me any favors. Received a Medal of Honor for actions on the 23rd of May, 1944. 23rd of May, 1944 was the day I told you about last night when the brother division, the 3rd division, lost over 900 Americans, 900 men from one division in one day. That's the day that you guys broke out from Anzio. He took out 3 machine gun nests, took several prisoners. It was just remarkable. If you look at the Medal of Honor citation, it's just like, wow, how could he do that? And then received, this is him in Epinal in France, receiving the Medal of Honor. From his division, there were 4 Native Americans that received the Medal of Honor, and he was taken off the line because by then, late 1944, the propaganda authorities back in the US realized that you were much more valuable as a living Medal of Honor recipient than dead. Let's not forget that over half of the Medal of Honor recipients from World War II, of those 472, over 50% died earning the ultimate medal. So he got into a big fight in the early 90s and was back in the news. There's a couple of things I want to talk about him that are really interesting. In the 90s, at the end of his life, he got into a big fight because of zoning laws. He lived in Virginia, I believe, zoning laws, and he flew his flag, and his flag was huge, it was humongous. It was like the size of this room. And the local zoning authorities said, like, you can't do that, it's against the law. And he said, you know what, do you know who I am? You know what I did in World War II? I'm going to fly my flag wherever I want, however I want, and as big as I want. And because of his background, because of his heroism in World War II, they basically gave up and said, okay, you can fly your flag, whatever you want, as big as you want, whatever. But what's interesting about him, and I want to go back to my notes here, is that, and there are some themes that emerge from this. So in 1945, he came from Mississippi, and there was a state senator there called Bilbo. That's not Bilbo Baggins from this guy called Theodore Bilbo. It's particularly obnoxious, but common back in 1945, racist. And he believed fundamentally in segregation. And one day he bumps into Vanty Barfoot from Mississippi, and Bilbo assumes that he's going to be just as racist as him, even though he is a Native American. And he basically tried to get Barfoot to support his cause, which was to continue segregation in the South. And let's not forget that even though in 1948, Truman desegregated the US military, in the 1960s, segregation in the National Guard continued with a vengeance throughout the South. So, at that level, desegregation formally happened. But at a local level, in Virginia, even in many other parts of the United States, try being an African-American and joining the National Guard. They fought in so many ways to stop any kind of advancement, years and years after the legislation formally was there. And Bilbo said, don't you agree? Don't you agree with our policy that we should continue to have segregation within the US Army? And he said, and these are very important words, he said, you know what? And this was in front of the press. He said, you know what? Us Southern boys, when we were over there fighting, i.e. unlike you, back here, war profiteering, us Southern boys, when we went over there, we saw lots of black soldiers, and they fought really well, just as hard as we did. So they need to be treated just the same as us. My point is that he had never fought alongside or seen any other blacks fighting in a war before. And many young men from the South who were blinkered, who were racist, etc., for the first time, they experienced what it was to be a full American in uniform fighting the same enemy. And they came back and their attitudes changed. So although we didn't have a revolution in attitudes and legislation post-war, as many people expected or wanted, certainly Native African Americans who served as fighter pilots in the Tuskegee Airmen, etc., they wanted change radically. It didn't happen. But what did happen was that many millions of Americans were exposed to other races in the same uniform for the first time. And that started to change attitudes. And it's that, we believe. So when you get to 1964, 1965, there's two pieces of fundamental legislation, Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act. Those were voted for by whites in this city. And those whites that voted for it had that memory of World War II. There was that cultural memory of what minorities had done, African Americans had done in World War II, and their attitudes had shifted just enough to allow that legislation finally to pass. So anyway, those are a couple of things about him, and I'm going to speed up now, otherwise I'm going to run out of time. So here again is an interesting example. So you have a minority that actually, these are Chinese Americans. In 1882, there was a piece of legislation in the US, that the Exclusion Act, which basically said that if you're Chinese, you're not a full American, you're not an American citizen. That was not repealed until 1943. And yet Chinese Americans, you could argue perhaps the most discriminated against in terms of not even being allowed to be an American, they had the largest proportion of their population, over 25%, served in the military. That's over 25%. A quarter of all Chinese Americans in this country served in World War II. Sergeant Lauren Lowe, 27th of June, 1944, he was in Saipan, and he was driving a bulldozer. The Japanese attacked. His platoon were under fire, and he jumped into his bulldozer, plowed into a fire, and for that was received the Silver Star, because basically his actions led to saving some of his platoon. His grandfather had worked on the railroads. You know, it's a classic Chinese immigrant story. His grandmother was a child slave in San Francisco in Chinatown. Can you imagine such a thing? That they had child female slaves in San Francisco in the 1880s. Very proud Chinese American. Some 25,000 Chinese Americans fought in World War II, and they never talked about it. He never talked about it, and it comes back to this notion of why didn't World War II veterans come home and talk about what they did in World War II to their families, etc., etc. But he didn't talk about it, and it was only after he died that they found his family found a little clipping from a local newspaper describing his actions when he'd saved his platoon in Saipan. So here we come to the famous Black Panthers. There's Patton on the left here. I'm writing about Patton right now. And Patton, people have to remember, if you've seen the movie, Patton's aide, i.e. his servant, I'll call him, because I'm being British, was a guy called Meeks, who was an African-American. So from 1939 to the end of the war, the guy that he spent most time with, literally, Patton here, was an African-American. They would talk about things all the time. Meeks was his name, Master Sergeant Meeks. And he said that, you know, I would sit there and we would chat away about the weather and his family, et cetera, et cetera. And that reminds me of another story about the USS Tang, which is the most decorated submarine from US submarine from World War II. 2 presidential unit citations. Captain O'Kane received the Medal of Honor. And in the Navy, certainly on a submarine, blacks weren't even given a rating. You didn't even have a rating. I mean, you're nothing. And yet the captain, O'Kane, of the Tang, was served every day. Imagine being in that really claustrophobic space, that capsule, that bubble under the water. Or every day you're as close as you possibly can be to other human beings. And Captain O'Kane had a black, African-American orderly. And they got on famously. They would spend hours and hours and hours together. Yeah, again, that proximity, that experience of being close to other people you would never have been close to like that in civilian life did break down attitudes. So O'Kane certainly was never ever going to be a racist again. And Patton wasn't a racist. He was anti-Semitic, but he certainly, I'll rephrase that, he was sometimes made anti-Semitic statements, but he certainly wasn't prejudiced against African Americans. And famously, the Black Panthers is the first all-black army unit, tankers in World War II. They served with great heroism and very effectively. That 761st Tank Battalion was regarded as one of the most useful. And when I say useful, the guys that were trying to win World War II didn't mess about. They were not going to give false compliments. You either got the job done and killed the enemy and advanced and helped out other units, or you didn't. They didn't hand out, they didn't say you're good when you were bad. The 36th Infantry Division was a bad division, demoralized, didn't get the job done. 761st got the job done and received high plaudits from division commanders, etc. Patton famously, when he greeted them and before they went into combat on November the 7th, 1944, he stood up on top of an armored vehicle. He had his pistol at his hip, and he said, I don't care. Basically, I don't care what color you are. You're going to go out there and you're going to kill those sons of bitches. And the more you kill, the happier I'll be. Doesn't matter. Which basically says a lot about Patton, but it also says a lot about how attitudes in parts of the US military were had changed a lot. This is not the Civil War anymore. This is we had a job to do, and if you could do it, it didn't matter what color you were. So they fought through the Battle of the Bulge, and interestingly, I think what's interesting about this unit is that it produced quite a few civil rights activists. So the NAACP had around 50,000 members before World War II. By 1945, it had over 450,000 members of the NAACP. And it's from that organization that you get the heart and soul of the civil rights movement post-war in the United States. They had been radicalized by war. And when I say radicalized, I mean they thought to themselves, why am I fighting racism and fascism here? Why am I seeing my black comrades die? Why are we just as good as all the white guys? And we have to go back to a place where we can't even sit on the same bus. It's hard to, I think it's hard to explain and moreover understand the level of anger that black veterans felt when they came back from Europe. The disillusionment. I mean, you had lynchings of GIs in uniforms, not just in the South. That's an appalling thing to happen to people who basically defeated mass genocidists. When we go to the Holocaust Museum and you think about a black American fighting, losing their friends all the way through that bitter long winter of 1944-45, and they actually did liberate concentration camps. And you think about the achievement of that immensity is incredible. So here we have John Basilone. If you've seen The Pacific, the TV series, he's one of the star characters. That's the TV series that came after Band of Brothers, set in the Pacific, and they chose key characters. And John Basilone's a great character because that's him at Arlington. Because he's an Italian American. His father was born actually not far from Salerno, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about him. He received the Medal of Honor on the 19th of February 1945. He basically fought for 2 or 3 nights. People say massively outnumbered, and manned a machine gun. Didn't stop firing. I don't know how. Maybe for 2 or 3 days. Huge heroism. Received the Medal of Honor. Came back to the United States, and then didn't want to go on war bond tours anymore, didn't want to fly the flag for raising money for the US. He wanted to go back into combat, and he re-enlisted in the Marines. So you can imagine, you go and fight in hell, you receive the Medal of Honor, you know, you're a superstar, and then you say, no, I'm done, I want to go re-enlist. And then he was killed, tragically, just a couple of months before the end of the war. It's an Italian American. So Italian Americans on the Eastern Seaboard escaped the destiny of many Californians who were Italian Americans. So 1941, we have Japanese Americans are enemy aliens. They're the enemy, so we have to intern them. Didn't have to, but they did. And then you have Italian Americans. They're also the enemy. We're fighting Mussolini and the Italians. So on the Eastern Seaboard, it was impossible to imprison several hundred, 600,000 US citizens. You're not going to do that. It's impossible. And local communities would have refused to allow that to happen because Italian Americans were so interwoven and so fundamentally American. I mean, if you go to Brooklyn or other places or New York, it's Little Italy, Little Italy. You're not going to put all of Little Italy behind a wire fence. In California, the numbers are relatively small. And in California in 1942, we actually did send over 250 Italian Americans to internment camps. Joe DiMaggio, am I pronouncing that right? Holly, am I right in getting that right? Right. Joe DiMaggio, my English accent, my English attempt to pronounce an American Italian name. Anyway, Joe DiMaggio, his dad was not a full American citizen, and was classified as an enemy alien, and they weren't allowed to go more than 5 miles from their home. So Joe DiMaggio's dad, the family had a restaurant on Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco, and his dad couldn't go to his own restaurant because he was an Italian American. Finally, it wasn't until 1943 that basically the politicians in this country said, you know what, there's an awful lot of Italian Americans, like guys like John Basilone, that are fighting for this country, and we need to end this. There's an example of an immigrant group who you would think are so fundamentally a part of the fabric of this immigrant nation, being prejudiced against and having to deal with that. So this is Lieutenant General Morris Rose, one of the great division commanders, 3rd Armored Division at the end. and tragically died. I think he was 45 years old on the March the 30th, 1945. He was in a Jeep with other officers, and the SS surrounded him, and they killed him. Interestingly, he did not describe himself as a Jewish American. And when you go to his grave, which is in Luxembourg, I believe, he does not have the Star of David on his grave. And he was obviously a Jewish American, because I've written it there. That must be true. But he was part of that Jewish community that went into the US Army in the 20s and 30s that didn't announce they were Jewish because they knew that they would be prejudiced against. So better just to keep your mouth shut. He looks white, looks like a good wasp, you know? So why handicap myself? Just, I'm not going to talk about the fact that I'm Jewish. But anyway, it's interesting because there were 4.5 million Jews in America during World War II, and they served in just the same proportion as white, so-called white Americans in World War II. But someone like that, he's the most senior Jewish military figure within the US Army in World War II. The fact that he rose so high and he had to actually hide his Jewishness says a lot about attitudes towards the Jewish population within the United States. There's been a deep-seated anti-Semitism in this country and many countries for an awful long time. Harry Stewart here, Tuskegee Airman. He's still alive. He's like, I think he's 101. I'm not sure. He's 101. But I mentioned earlier on, and I want to stress this again, not a single black civilian airline pilot before World War II. This guy became, on the April the 1st, 1945, he became he shot down 3 planes in one day. It's Easter Sunday. And we all know that you probably have heard about the Tuskegee Airmen, the famous Red Tails, 332nd Fighter Wing. Remarkable pilots, remarkable, incredible, all black unit of awesome fighter pilots. I mean, they were kick-ass. They were flying in a wonderful plane, by the way. That helped, as he told me. So it did help flying a P-47. That made a big difference because that was an extraordinarily effective, deadly plane. So he grew up near LaGuardia Airport. And when he was a kid, he was like, he just saw these planes landing every day. And he said, I want to be a pilot. And he said, World War II was the best thing that ever happened to me and to my fellow Black Americans, African Americans. He said, because all the things that some of us have wanted to do, particularly me, I wanted to be a flyer, I wanted to be a pilot. And there was no way that I was going to get to do that. But when we went to war, I got to live out my dream. I got to be a fighter pilot. I didn't just fly any old plane. I flew the best plane in the world. It was like, you know, the ultimate Porsche. Came back from World War II, applied to 2 airlines, rejected by both. And this goes to my point that you get this beautiful window of opportunity, of equality, of truth. In the sky, in a P-47, you're about as equal as you can be with anybody. Either you can shoot someone down or they shoot you down first. And you're going up against awesome enemy pilots. So that's a way of achieving something that is just like, there's no barrier to that. There's no limit. You know that you're the best. You're the top gun. And finally, I think it was in the 1980s, I have to check this, but finally the 2 airlines that rejected him, he didn't make this public, but someone else did. The 2 airlines publicly apologized for the fact that they had discriminated against him. This is a highly decorated, extremely smart, he went on to be a very well-educated guy who wouldn't want him to be an airline pilot. And then we have a Japanese-American Medal of Honor recipient. He's the first. That was April the 5th, 1945. It's a classic Medal of Honor story. You know, he gets the Medal of Honor because he jumps on a grenade and he saves a couple of other guys' lives. That happened many times. That's probably the quickest way that you can receive the Medal of Honor, is to jump on a grenade and give your life to save others. But, you know, here's the terrible irony of this, is that he is fighting, and it's in the European theater, Let's not forget that we didn't send Japanese Americans to the Pacific for a very good reason, because their own side would have killed them. That was the main fear, that other Americans would kill them because they were Japs. I say Japs, that's what they were called. In fact, they were depicted as yellow monkeys in propaganda posters all through America. So last night when I was talking about this, and I don't want to get too diverted, but one of the things that complicates our discussion of Japanese Americans in World War II is that this country was taught, encouraged, in fact, with a huge amount of resources were put into making the Pacific War a race war. The fantastic book by a guy called John Dower about what he describes as the race war in the Pacific. So, you know, you had at West Virginia, a small town in West Virginia, there's a front page photograph in 1943 of a housewife standing on her porch, and she's holding up 2 ears, Japanese ears, as a trophy that her husband sent her from the Pacific. The post office, the main post office, the branch in San Francisco that dealt with mail coming from the Pacific, would have dried testicles, scalps, ears. It was a daily nightmare sorting through the mail coming back from the Pacific from GIs, sending mementos back to their wonderful housewife that would stand there on the porch for the local newspaper holding up 2 desiccated Japanese ears. My boy's doing a good job. He's killing Japs. Yellow monkeys, as they were described, or depicted in propaganda posters all through this country. So if you're a Japanese American, and let's not forget, the most decorated unit from World War II, the most decorated, and I would say by far, when you look at it in terms of numbers, is the 442nd Infantry Regiment that fought in Italy, not on Saipan, not on Iwo Jima, not on Okinawa, in Italy, 442nd, Japanese Americans. This guy, first Medal of Honor recipient, his parents were in an internment camp in California. So when they learned of his death, they had to mourn him and have the memorial service in the internment camp. Your son has given his life to defeat virulent racism a long way from home, and you can't even mourn him properly. So I'm coming to the end now, but I just wanted to mention this Harry Kazarian, just because I wanted to emphasize or underline yet again just how diverse this racial quilt of Americans who fought in World War II was. So he's an Armenian American, and there were over 19,000 so-called Armenian Americans that fought in World War II. And he is the most decorated soldier from Rhode Island. So he won more medals earned more medals rather. I don't like the term won. I don't think you win any medal. I think you earn it. And he received I think it's the DSC on the 11th of June, 1945 in the Pacific and Okinawa. I love those guys' uniforms from Okinawa. So this is my ugly mug here. This is taken in April just this year, just to show you how, you know, this story of World War II is not dead. There's still guys and women alive from World War II and there are some that still wake up every night and have nightmares. And there are some that the war will always define them. It's in their heart, at the core of who they have been ever since. It made them. It shaped their entire view of what it was to be an American, what it was to be a human being, what it was to be a father, a husband. And this is Remigo Kabakama, again, my horrible English accent. He joined the US Navy, age 16. He served in World War II and Korea, and his father survived. You may have heard of the murderous Bataan Death March. And he was at the World War II Memorial, and I went to meet him. It was great to shake his hand. But the point is that he was with a bunch of Filipino Americans. And until the 1980s, 360,000 Filipinos served in the US military in World War II. 360,000. Till the 1980s, they didn't have full benefits as other American citizens had. It took until the 1980s before we took Filipinos and gave them the same pension, gave them the same benefits as other Americans, so-called Americans. So I'm going to end now, and I just wanted to show you a poster for the WWII campaign in World War II, and this was all about winning, winning the war against fascism abroad, but also gaining something at home: true democracy, true equality, if that's ever possible. But certainly aiming for a double victory. If we're going to give this, we want something back. We'd like to be able to vote, for example. We've allowed former Nazis, some of them not even rehabilitated, we've allowed tens and tens of thousands of blue-eyed, blonde-haired Nazis to be able to vote. We liberated them from themselves. We liberated them from the Nazis they elected. We liberated the genocidists from the people that told them to go and kill millions. And yet we come home and we can't vote. So I believe fundamentally that what happened in terms of, and we're going back to the theme of character as destiny, what happened in World War II was a seismic shock to American society. Women felt truly liberated and empowered for the first time in all different ways. Over 360,000 American women from different backgrounds and races served in uniform in World War II. There was no going back. As Julia Parsons said to me, I was wearing a wave uniform, breaking codes, sinking U-boats, and then suddenly I had to go back and cook dinner for my husband in the kitchen. I didn't like that at all. It really upset me. I was not going to spend the rest of my life doing that. And that was the same for many other women. They had seen, if you like, they'd seen the promised land. They'd lived in the promised land. Even if it was 18 hours a day in Washington State building B-17 bombers, it still felt a hell of a lot better than being enslaved in a kitchen. When you look at, in particular, the African-American experience, you have to say that those guys that served in that tank unit that were fighting in tanks through Germany in the spring of 1945, that they came home and they were absolutely, if they hadn't been determined to break down racism and segregation, they were absolutely determined to do it when they came home. We're not talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands, but it only took a few people here and there with that fervent belief that they were actually going to gain something from this. That why should they have given everything and seen other people give everything and not come back and have some form of legal equality? The fact that it took to 1964, 65 is, to me, I guess it's not that astonishing, but it is disgusting. It's a national tragedy. So I think that women were empowered and liberated. Various minorities felt incredibly proud to serve and came back and became different kinds of Americans. And finally, my point is that when I asked Harry Stewart about his patriotism, he said that it was the first time that I actually felt like I had a part ownership. So that, he's a Black American. It's the first time I felt I had some ownership of my country, that I was valuable, that it was my country. So many communities, Native Americans, Italian Americans, Japanese Americans, I've mentioned many, they were not just fighting for the United States. They were fighting for their own community and their own sense of pride in their community and their neighbors and their friends. If you came from an Indian reservation, and it was a reservation, if you came from a ghetto, if you came from the barrio, you're not fighting for a WASP in Rhode Island. You're fighting for your family and your neighbors and your way of life that you know as an American. That America is what you're fighting for. That is what they called my America. I'm fighting for my family, my community. And that fight was particularly potent and powerful if you were prejudiced against, if you lacked basic civil rights, because you realized that the America that you were fighting for was one that needed to change, and fast. So desegregation of the US military in 1948, it wasn't about some act of generosity. Truman didn't sit there and say, oh, you know what, you've done a good job, thank you very much, we're not gonna have desegregation in the US military. He didn't have any choice. There was no choice. The US military wouldn't have functioned properly. It couldn't function without desegregation. And he knew, he'd been particularly moved and influenced Truman by the massive outbreak of racism that occurred in the United States, in the South, particularly after World War II. The Jim Crow crackers were more scared of empowered, educated, smart, young, aggressive, liberated Black Americans coming back to the South and going, you know what, this is, the game's over, there's another war going to happen now. They were terrified. And they had every reason to be, because they knew that things were going to have to change. And that's why you had this really, really disturbing reaction against Black GIs coming back. Black GIs in my country, there were race riots in England because caused by the fact that Black GIs, English girls loved them. They were cool. You know, they'd never met. They had great music, they danced really well, they were like, you know, they were really sweet, they were really nice, and they dated, English girls dated Black guys all the time. White GIs in the UK, like, what the hell? Oh my God, that cute girl, she's dating that. What the hell? And they'd be in the same bar together, they'd be in the same dance clubs, etc. And there were race riots in Britain because of that, because English girls liked Black GIs. So those guys come back. They've been in a nightclub in Piccadilly. They've fought, they've received the Medal of Honor. They've fought across Europe. They've liberated countless millions, and they come back to the US and like suddenly they're second-class citizens. Like, excuse me, I had a really good time over there. That was cool, even though I was being shot at all the time. It was better than this. And then you look into the fear, the anxiety in the South in particular of white power elites worried about what's going to happen because they're in the minority. You know, let's not let we can't let them vote. Can't let them. You know, they must never be able to vote. So I think this notion of fighting for my America boils down to the idea that there are many Americas. My idea of America is very different to your idea of America, etc. But it's also quintessentially American. That out of this really catastrophic, terribly traumatizing experience, so many millions of Americans were fundamentally changed. And they were fundamentally changed because they looked at other Americans in a different way. They had experienced something that was so uniting and communal and so incredibly effective in breaking down divisions to a certain extent that it changed their fundamental attitudes to what it was to be an American and what it was to allow other Americans to fully realize citizenship and civil rights, etc. I think it's just from that point of view, if you were female, a minority, disadvantaged in many ways, and certainly a victim of institutional legalized prejudice, World War II was a very, very good thing. It was a very powerful accelerator for social change in so many different ways. It's a shame that we have to go to war and then once lose everything to be able to really change society powerfully in that way. But one of the great pluses of that experience, if you survived, if you were not one of the 400,000 who were killed, is that you came back to America that, whether it liked it or not, was going to have to change and did change. So thank you very much for listening to me. It's been really fun. Ooh. I think I only have like 3 minutes, Holly, don't I? So if you have any questions, yeah.
Many people have received the Medal of Honor, and some of them would have received it immediately. Were there any people who maybe had that Medal of Honor delayed because they were from an oppressed or marginalized community?
Yeah, there are lots of examples. Yeah, I mean, the 442nd Japanese American unit, they had to wait over 40 years. So they were not in 1945 seen as being the most decorated. It was when President Clinton corrected that. I think he awarded, I think it was 10 Medal of Honors. So that's when they suddenly they got to the top of the list. So yes, it's a very good question, because in the case of certainly African Americans, certainly Japanese Americans, there was a lot of prejudice at the time. You know, you had to have senior officers and eyewitnesses make reports so that you could receive the Medal of Honor. It's quite a laborious process. It's very easy at any stage of that process to go, oh, you know, not the right race, therefore. Yeah, it's a very good question. Yeah, there was even in, what I'm basically saying is that even in during the Second World War, there was prejudice and racism within the award system, and that was corrected. And Clinton did a lot of it in the 90s. But the fact that it took that long, and obviously, you know, I think of the Japanese Americans that received belated awards, that hardly any of them were still alive, which is one of the sad things, you know, that it's after they've passed away that they're finally recognized. But there has been, I think, a very commendable effort in the last 2 or 3 decades to make sure that these groups are recognized. And I don't think it's just about tokenism. I think it's genuinely, after several decades, it was time to go, okay, here's the evidence. Everyone agrees. Everybody within the US military agrees. We need to recognize these guys. We need to correct a wrong, you know? Yeah. So, yeah. Oh, yeah. You don't want to get me started about renaming things. All I'll say that as history teachers, when I used to go to Richmond, I would go down, is it Monument Road? And I'm like, that was an awesome lesson in the Civil War. That was like, you know, like 20 minutes in a car, and you'd see the Civil War. But then I thought, oh my God, well, a lot of these monuments were erected after the Civil War as a reminder that, oh, by the way, guess what? You're going to be under the thumb, under the boot. It was a re-infliction of oppression. But at the same time, I'm a bit ambiguous about just getting rid of monuments. And so, for example, I was in Germany about a month ago, and I'd like to still see statues of Hitler everywhere. That's my personal point of view. I'd like the Germans to be constantly reminded, wherever they look, that there was a guy called Hitler. I'd like them to be reminded of the fact that that guy carried out the Holocaust. So it's very, gets murky when you talk about erasing history, you know? Yeah.
Have you ever experienced with how the culture recruiting, members in the military, just the patriotism and the propaganda was out, or it was saving you from your lifestyle being downtrodden?
That's a really good question. With the Tuskegee Airmen, there were really fantastic recruiting posters that you can find. You go and Google them. So that was kind of like, it was a really sexy, cool propaganda campaign to try and recruit people into that unit. But that comes back to the point, which is like, what were the influences that were the most effective in terms of changing institutions? So I would say that the Great Migration from the South to the Midwest, to Washington State, to work in the war industries to produce tanks and planes, etc. That was a massive social change in the US. You had this second great movement of people from the South going to work in factories, etc. Their wages, American wages doubled during World War II. And it was an economic miracle. The middle class literally was created by World War II. So you come back to this question of like, oh, did we really care about them, or were they useful? And Black Americans were incredibly useful, and women were also absolutely essential to winning the war, because we needed someone to build the tanks and the airplanes. So there's this, it's double-edged, And I think that also when you think about some of these groups, like the Chicanos I showed you, the National Guard unit, all those guys were able to feed their families when they were in the National Guard. The Bedford Boys, and that is as rural and white as you can get in rural Virginia in the 1930s. They were joining, because they were patriotic, but more importantly, they got $1 a week for attending a drill practice. My point is that economic necessity fueled some of the so-called patriotism. Yeah, they were very happy to wear a uniform because they could feed their families. They were very happy to go and work in a factory in Chicago or or Seattle, because they actually could live a decent life for the first time. But economic opportunity also fueled the so-called pride of wearing the uniform or serving your country, because you could actually put food on the table. So we have to mix that factor into why suddenly everyone was super patriotic. It's because, well, I don't mind. I can feed the kids, Anyway, I will end now, because we're going to